Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky webinar series. Again, my name is Megan. I'm on the communications team for the project, and as usual, I will be your host for today's webinar. We'll start with our usual way. As we continue to build respectful relationships, we would like to begin with a call to gather, drumming and singing by Muskeg Lake Cree Nation to appreciate the cultural practices of the Indigenous partners guiding this project. The drum is considered a connection to the natural world, and together, drumming and singing are essential elements that help maintain Indigenous identity and cultural heritage. All right, we have a quick protocol that we'll go over. So this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky YouTube channel. That will happen after the webinar, probably next week or so. There are closed captions available on your toolbar. It shows you how to get to it there. And you can feel free to enter any questions into the Q&A or in the chat at any point throughout the webinar, but the questions for the presenter will be addressed at the end of the presentation. So in today's webinar, Practical Grazing Management, Balancing Forage, Land, and Goals, Tom Harrison will cover the core principles of grazing management, including key considerations for developing a grazing management plan, understanding carrying capacity, and applying rest, recovery, and rotational grazing in a practical, goal-focused way. Rotational grazing will be explored through the lens of aligning forage capacity, land health, and operator goals to build systems that work for both the land and the people who manage it. Tom Harrison holds a Bachelor of Science in Arts and a Master of Science degree from the College of Agriculture at the University of Saskatchewan. He has more than 25 years of experience as a professional agrologist working in agri-environmental programming as both a consultant and with organizations such as the Saskatchewan Wetland Conservation Corporation, Water Security Agency, Saskatchewan Indian Agricultural Program, and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Tom most recently served as Executive Director of SodCap Inc. and is currently the Program Manager with the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation. He also operates a 250-head cow-calf ranch with his wife, Tracy, and their daughter, Caitlin, bringing a practical, producer-focused perspective to grazing management. That's a lot. We really appreciate you taking the time out to do this webinar with us today, Tom.
Let's give her a whirl. I'm going to be asking Maddie to advance the slides for me because we had some issues with Teams here this morning already. So anyways, let's start then. So, okay, first of all, if I sound a little incoherent, we're in the middle of a blizzard and been pulling calves all morning. I think we got 5 into the barn and the barn got full. I ended up pulling calves into the shop, just trying to keep them warm because we got a foot of snow already and the wind's coming in sideways. And then to top it all, like I said, the team doesn't work on my computer right now for whatever. I think sometimes technology is passing me by. So that bio is a little bit dated. It's probably 35 years of experience, and that just means I'm getting along in the tooth here. So, anyways, let's start. First of all, thank you, Maddie, and thank you, The Bridge, for inviting me. The title was Maddie's idea. Maddie came up with it. Thank you. I'm not very creative, and that's the kind of thing. We live about 30 miles north of Regina. Nearest little town is probably called Lumsden. We're in Treaty 4. One of the things that we do to acknowledge the treaties is that our ranch is open to First Nations people to practice their treaty rights in a safe place, and we're a part of the Treaty Land Sharing Network. So let's switch slides there, Maddie. So, and as Megan mentioned, I am the program manager with the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation. Right now, if you don't know about us, we are a registered charity and land trust. That means we can hand out tax receipts from CRA, and we can hold conservation agreements and conservation easements. And we've been doing this for about 6 years. We started up in about 2019, and we've been working regularly with ranchers, farmers, and others in signing agreements. And so far, I think we're close to about 60 different agreements impacting close to 500,000 acres. Our biggest priorities when we started, amongst others, is grassland conservation. That was one of the biggest focus, but also, the viability of the ranching community. And this means that if we have a strong use for our grasslands, they will probably more likely to be retained and managed properly. And what we see is that most ranchers that we work with are very conscientious about way they manage the lands. I don't know if anybody had the opportunity, but yesterday there was a webinar hosted by the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and two of the producers on there, Mark Highmore and Neil Block, are two producers we've worked with in the past. And they said the same thing. I hope you had the chance to listen to those guys, because I thought that they were very good. If you didn't have the chance, it'll be on Canadian Wildlife Federation's probably channel or website or YouTube or whatever. So because this is a relationship with the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky, also wanted to comment on some of the work that we're doing with indigenous relationships. And we are, for the last 2 years, we've been working with the Mistawasses First Nation through the Bridge program to assess and help develop grazing management plans on 2 different pastures that they manage. One is a pasture, and I'll give some examples later of it, that they lease out to a local rancher. And the other one is a buffalo pasture that they're starting to create, and they're just in the process of developing that. So it's been a really good relationship I found working with them. And this year we're expanding our focus a little bit with some of the First Nations. We're going to hopefully be going to Thunderchild and doing an assessment of their ranch. And we've also got about 7 producers from the File Hills area that we're hopefully going to go out and do assessments and partner with this year. One thing about First Nations is and you maybe heard this before, but the land tenure is always an issue when you're dealing with them, because there's all sorts of different options that you have to do, whether like you're doing land code like Mistawasses does, or you're doing Buckshee leases, or you're got certificate of possessions. There's all sorts of different things going on in the background. If you don't understand that, and if you work with First Nations, you should bring yourself up to speed on the land tenure and the land governance structure on First Nations. So next slide, please. So many different ways of planning and different ways of doing the planning thing. And I pulled out, 3 different scenarios from 3 different documents, just to give you an example of the process of planning for grazing management. The one thing you're going to see in all of these is, 1, they're goal oriented. 2, they offer a complete resource analysis, and 3, they involve a feedback loop. So you're always going back, and you're either reevaluating your goals or you're reevaluating your resources, and you're hopefully you always get a balanced approach where your resource availability and your goals are in line with each other. And it's a constant cycle of doing that over and over and over again. So and we'll talk a little bit more. I've got some examples about goals and developments later, but first I want to talk about how we approach some of this before we start planning with this. And I'll get the next slide there, Maddie. So when we work with Mistawasses, when we work with other ranchers that we do, the first thing that we do is we look at the data that exists for the ranch or property or First Nations or whatever we're working with. And that involves looking at things like imagery, looking at soils, ecosites, habitats for wildlife data. We will pull critical habitat in the Southwest where it does exist, and any other kind of data that's available publicly. We'll just it's a desktop exercise because that's an extremely important part of our resource analysis. Gathering the data, and like I said, if you watch that webinar, one of the things you found out is that every ranch is different, every First Nation is different, and not everybody's the same, and so you can't apply a cookie cutter approach to grazing management. And so we have to have that data, and that will give you a lot of information of that. Once we've collected the data, like the desktop data, we want to get out in the field. So next slide, please. And typically what we do is we will do field assessments, and that involves, if it's native grasslands, we'll do the rangeland assessments. If they're forest, we'll do forest assessments. We use the tame health assessments, actually out of Alberta because Saskatchewan doesn't have one, and we'll do riparian health assessments. These documents, the protocols for these documents, are all on the Prairie Conservation Action Plan website, and they were developed in the 2000s. I was lucky enough to be a part of that development, and this year the rangeland has been reassessed and redeveloped and just published now, and so there'll be a new version of that coming out fresh in 2026. So that's really kind of exciting. The other thing we do is when we get out there is we will actually sometimes do bird surveys, and we have done insect surveys. So basically gathering field data to tell us what that pasture looks like, what's the condition of it, how healthy is it, what's the threats, what's the risk, all that kind of stuff. And that's our process before we even get into planning. And so when we get into planning, next slide, please, sir. What we try to do is we want to design a plan that achieves the goals. And I haven't even talked about how you set goals yet, but I'll get into that in a little bit. But when we're doing the planning, we pay attention to the basic principles of grazing management. And I've listed out those 4 common grazing planning principles, and I'll get into a little bit of that. The process, though, is to tailor that plan to each operation and take a whole farm or a whole ranch approach to it. So you want to look at exactly what they're trying to do over 365 days, not just one field in one pasture. So you want to take that whole approach and tailor that that plan to each operation. And that's so important because, like I mentioned before, each operation is different. Each operation has their own goals, and each operation has their own resources, whether it's land or cattle or personnel. Some people are just a mom and pop operation like I am, and other people have 3 or 4 families with 4 hired hands. So how much work can you actually get done? So anyways, next slide, please. So dig in a little bit deeper into the balancing forage supply and demand. This is probably the most important principle that I think you have to pay attention to when you're working with ranchers, or if you're ranching yourself. You want to do that, basically keep the range healthy, and you want to do it year in, year out, so that you have a long-term plan to making sure that you always have forage in front of you, because you're going to run into wet years and you're going to run into dry years, and you got to come through all the best. And typically that means paying attention to your stocking rates. And when we talk about stocking rates, that's basically how many cows can you run on that ranch for 1 year. And we usually talk about things like in animal unit months per acre. That means an animal unit is like 1,000-pound cow, and how much it can eat in 1 month, and how many acres you need to do that. But you're going to hear guys talk about different ways to do that. Like especially in the Southwest, you'll talk about, well, how many cows can that quarter section carry? And so you'll hear that comment. So there's different ways of talking about that, and that's just basically, trying to figure out how many cows that particular ranch can sustain in a long-term, year in, year out situation. So the things that help us decide what those stocking rates are is, one, pasture condition. That's why you do the field assessments. We know that the forage production is in a linear relationship with range condition and pasture health, so that you know that stocking rates on a healthy pasture are probably 30 to 40%, can be 30 to 40% higher than an unhealthy pasture. And that means, so that if you're starting out and you're not in good shape, you may or may not have to reduce, stocking rates to see some improvement. The second thing is, you got to be aware of your soils and your range site. And you saw part of the GIS exercise that we did there is we pulled what we call the soil association maps, and soil association maps are actually pretty good, and they dictate, what the productive capability of those things are. And even though grasslands, most of the grasslands that still exist are on marginal soils, there are still some that are on, what we would call, loamy type sites, or kind of better soils. But I mean, if you know what your soils are, and you know what your range sites are, you know what the potential is for that area. And again, for example, if you're on a loamy or on a gravelly or a thin range site, you can expect to have stocking rates 40% less than what you have on a loamy range site. Same thing with climate or soil zone. As you go more north and west, north and east, the moisture conditions get better. Soils are typically better. It's in a higher moisture precipitation than, say, the brown. So if you compare to what you think you can stock, it's basically twice as much in the aspen parkland than it is in the dry mixed grass prairie. So I mean, you got to know where you are and what the climate is. And just an example is that down in the south, commonly those really extreme south areas, you talk about stocking rates in the ballpark of 4 to 6 cows per quarter section. You go up by North Battleford in that area, guys are putting 20 to 25 on a quarter section. And they do that, maybe that's a little bit high, but I mean, they do that and they get away with it because of the moisture conditions. And so, whereas in the south, you're just living in a drought prone area. The other things you have to be aware of too is slope, places where cows don't go. Slope, you get extreme slopes, anything over 30%, and you start seeing a reduction in the ability of the animals to actually move into the. If you get more than 60% slope, their cows just don't go there. So if you've got a rolling topography, well, don't assign any stocking rates to that kind of areas. Other things like like if your pastures contain huge blocks of saline or coniferous forest, those are basically unusable. And then distance from water too. Cows don't travel more than a mile from water. So if you're running a big field and they've got to travel more than a mile from water, they just don't use it. So don't count on them going out there at all. So anyways, when you start looking at stocking rates, again, go to the Prairie Conservation Action Plan. A guy by the name of Jeff Thorpe, who was working with the Saskatchewan Research Council back in the 2000s, he gathered data from all over Saskatchewan, from the old PFRA, from the Minister of Agriculture, from the group I was working for, the Wetland Corporation, from Ducks Unlimited, any data that was collected on range condition or range health. He sifted through all that stuff, and he's come up with documents on plant communities in each ecozone and each ecosite, and it's all on the PCAP website. It's a really, really good resource if you're trying to do range assessment and recommend stocking rates. So take a peek at that. The other document, if you ever get your hands on, is a really, really cool document. It's by Zuhair Abogandia, and it's from 1990, so it's getting a little bit dated like me. But it's range management planning. It's an old document out of circulation, but the principles are still there. Okay, so next slide there, Maggie or Maddie, sorry. Rest. That's really, it's almost as important as balancing the forage supply and demand. And think about it, like photosynthesis is what drives the health of these plants. If you look at the way plants grow, like early stages of growth and regrowth after it's been grazed, or points where the plant is elongating and producing seed heads, that's a point in time when the photosynthesis producing the carbohydrate reserves for the plant to grow cannot keep up to the growth of the plant. And therefore, at that point in time, these are during the early stages, they've got to rely on carbohydrate reserves that exist in the crown and the roots of those plants. So you're basically drawing your carbon out of the soil and out of the plants and to make that plant grow. And it's not until those plants start to recover and their growth slows down that the photosynthesis process starts sending the carbohydrate reserves or the photosynthase down back into the crown and the soil. And that's the energy plant needs to be healthy and to sustain itself over winter when there's no photosynthesis going on. And if you continuously harvest when the plant is rapidly growing, you continually draw on the reserves of those plants, and that's when those plants get weaker and are subject to competition, and then the health of the range starts to deteriorate, and the health of the plants starts to deteriorate. So having rest is really, really important, and it's got to be during the growing season. That rest has got to allow those plants to fully recover. So you can't do it, and you have to be aware that the growing season in some places in Saskatchewan too is relatively short. Like in Southwest Saskatchewan, you're done your growing season by July 1st. The optimum temperature for plant growth is 18 degrees. You start pushing like 25 to 30 degrees, those plants basically go dormant and aren't functioning. And at the same time, if you're in drought-prone areas, the same thing happens. Those plants basically go dormant during things. So you can't count on resting during, non-growing type seasons. And then there's differences between plants. I did my master's degree on actually looking at this stuff, looking at rest recovery or rest requirements for different species. At the same time, there's another fellow that was looking at pretty much the same thing, different species, was Brendan Kalinko. And what I found was, and we measured it in growing degree days, but it works out to if you're harvesting a tame or like a crested wheatgrass or a smooth bone grass or something like that, it takes about 55 to 60 days to recover, where you should be able to go back and graze it again. And typically in drought situations, it doesn't happen because the plant's basically shut down. So you maybe get, 2 grazes if you're lucky on early graze stuff. But once you get past, June, July, there's just not enough regrowth time. If you look at some of the native species, stuff like northern wheatgrass or winter fat, where Brendan did his research on, we were looking at a requirement for rest of close to 400 days. That means you've got to look at some sort of rest rotation type system where you give those native species almost a whole year off. So anyways, next slide. Um, the third principle is distribution of your livestock, and be aware of two things. One, there's natural variation thing in that exists naturally that affects the distribution of cattle, and there's things you can do as a management tool to influence your distribution. So if you look at things like slope or aspect, like I mentioned before, cows don't like to go on certain things that are too steep. There's different vegetation type communities that they don't like going grazing. If you've ever seen cows want to graze or try to graze little blue stem, you've pretty well got to starve them before they'll start grazing little blue stem. So you can have a completely overgrazed pasture and a really healthy stand of little blue stem. Riparian areas. Cattle are naturally attracted to riparian areas, and the climate too. Like their distribution in hot, dry times will be to find someplace cool. They'll go that. If you are grazing during a wet cycle or when it's cooler, they seem to spread themselves out. And there's nothing you can do about the climate. It's how you manage in conjunction or interaction with these natural features. So when you get into management, obviously water and fencing are the two big tools that you have at your disposal on how you control the distribution of those animals. And there's every different ranch has its way of fencing, and we could have a whole presentation on fencing types, and me and Mark or Hi Mark can argue our heads off about high tensile fencing. But anyways, those are two really important tools on how you do that. And water especially is there. It creates a focal point for livestock, and it helps them move to certain areas around there. Depending on what your goals are, you can move animals, wherever with water. That's probably your strongest food. You can also, use salt and mineral. That's another focal point, and especially in large pastures where, like cattle, maybe there's areas where the cattle aren't getting to. They're not getting to certain areas of the pasture. You may want to use that. But if distribution in the pasture is not a problem, and cattle are getting everywhere, I wouldn't be putting salt and mineral out on those. I put them where the water is, because when you put salt and mineral out, or where you put water sites, typically there's a place of destruction. They beat it into the dirt, and there's lots of opportunities for weed invasion and that kind of thing. So if you're going to destroy one spot, I just destroy one spot. But I mean, ask your question all the time: are you trying to influence distribution? In some cases, if you fenced appropriately, maybe you don't even need that. So the other thing is beware of the type of animal you're using. Cow calf pairs or don't move around as much. Oh, sorry. Get into the next slide there, Maddie. Sorry. Um, uh, yeah. Uh, so the cow calf pairs, they don't move around as much as they're pretty sedentary. They tend to stay in one spot, and they're creatures of habit. Whereas you have a bunch of yearlings, they're like crazy teenagers and all over. The other thing is season of use. Like if you're running a rotation, like I mentioned, that cattle are attracted to riparian areas, and more so in the hot, dry parts of it. If you go into like say the Missouri Control Areas, lots of potholes and things like that, and you put cattle out on a field that's got lots of potholes, and it's the middle of summer, they'll congregate down by those wetlands in proportion. But if you put them out there, say in October, November, when it's cooler, they seem to distribute themselves a lot better all through the whole pasture. And so be aware of that. Be aware of the season you're using it, what the interaction between that and the climate and what natural features on the landscape are. The other tool that's always is really interesting, especially in large pastures, and where cattle aren't distributing themselves very well, like using the whole practice of hazing them, like basically driving them out to it on horseback, moving them into an area, settle them down there, let them graze for a couple days, and then kind of move them back. It's kind of like rotational grazing without without fences, and you're doing it on horseback, and it's that's just it's pretty common there in certain areas. In fact, I'll give you an example. In the Cypress Hills, West Block, we did a project with the Cypress Hill Stockmen's Association and the Ministry of Environment's Park, or Minister of Parks, this last year it was. And so the West Block is about 30,000 acres, and it's continuous graze for policy reasons because they don't want fences out there. And there's a huge elevation challenge in that area. Like, you got like 700 to 800 feet of elevation from Battle Creek, which is the main water source, the only reliable water source, to the bench on the land. And we went in there and we worked with those guys, and this is something that's sort of been in the works for almost 20 years, is develop a water system that actually distributes the cattle up to the bench on a regular basis. And then that's complemented by this whole idea of hazing and settling. And I know the rider out there, he will actually push the cows certain areas of the West Block just to keep them grazing over in there, and act as rotation. And that works well in that scenario because the park doesn't want, they're there as a park, and they've got people and tourists coming all the time. They don't want them going fences and that other stuff. So the cows basically run wherever. And so it's a continuous grazing system, but it does work with a little bit of changes. And then we helped it out with the water development this last year. So full force forward this year, coming on in 26. Hopefully it's working. So a very expensive, very high-tech project that just imagine trying to push water from Battle Creek 750 feet up, and the amount of pressure you had to have to get it to the top. And that meant we had to use really high density pipe because like the pressure, I think, was 350 pounds per square inch at the base just to get the water up to the top. Anyways, I'm getting off on another project here. Next slide, please, sir. Patty. The last principle is deferment. And there's two areas that are really, really important here. One, and lots of guys do this, they separate their native and tame pastures. And as I mentioned before, the rest requirements for tame is completely different than native. And we've bred our tame pastures, our cressets and our bones. We've bred them to be early spring growers for the most. And for the most part, they're all C3 type grasses, early spring or early grasses. Whereas native is always a mix of C3 and C4 type grasses. And they do require longer rest requirements. And so splitting them off and managing them separately is always the thing. So, you can early, native later, and the longer you can do native, I think the better. Also, be aware of the natural sensitive areas that you have on your pasture. Riparian areas, in the spring, they are soft, subject to hugging and hummocking, overutilization, and in the summer they're probably, like I said, they're hot and dry areas. They're more attractive to the cattle and subject to getting beat up if you don't for grazing around either. And also, like, nesting and breeding grounds. And the picture in the left-hand corner of this one is a sagebrush, and one of the species that's really a concern in southwest Saskatchewan is the greater sage grouse. And be aware of that habitat and why that's so important. In areas are important. It's better to defer and avoid interaction during certain times of the year. So and just to be aware of and what you have on your landscape. So anyways, that's the four basic principles of grazing management. You pay attention to those when you're grazing management planning. You can be adaptive and non-prescriptive in the way you manage them. So like I said, I'm not really a big fan of cookie cutter approaches. Uh, but I mean, you pay attention to the principles, be aware of what you got on the landscape, be aware of what your goals are, and you can design a grazing system any way you want using those principles. So what I want to do now is I want to go back to our experience with Mistawasses. The next slide there, please. So what I've got in front of you is a list of goals that the Mistawasses Lands Committee came up with, and like I worked with them on this when we started this project, and you can see the things they're talking about. They're talking. We want to enhance our range health. They had a sneaking suspicion that it probably wasn't great. They were concerned about biodiversity. They've been going through dry cycles. They're concerned about drought preparedness. They want to make sure that they got adequate forage supplies so that when they rent the land out, they're renting it out in the right way. And they knew they were having problems with distribution and some areas underutilized, some areas overutilized, and they wanted to have some sort of grazing system, some sort of rotation in place, and they knew like their fencing and their water substandard. The other thing is because on the one pasture they lease it out, they really didn't have a grasp of the lease arrangements. It was sort of like guy, you rented to the guy, he did whatever he wanted to do, he paid his bill, and everybody was happy, but there was no ownership of the lands, and they wanted to take that back and develop a strong leaseor relationship and have more control on how the pasture was being, and at the same time they're always thinking about economic development and how can the people in the reserve be a part of this long term. Yeah, they've talked about getting their herd. Right now they're probably more concerned with getting that pasture set up. So I'm just going to be talking about the one pasture right now. I won't talk about the buffalo herd. That's question right. So like I said, when we next slide please. The resource analysis was critical. Once and it didn't necessarily happen in this order because we talked about goals afterwards. We did resource analysis back and we looked at things again. So it was like back and forth. We did some resource analysis, went back, talked about goals, and then we came back and we did more resource analysis. But we started looking at land and cattle. Like their pasture is about 4,000 acres. They don't have any cows. They lease it out, but they wanted to get better control on how many should be going out there, and that affected the forage availability and that kind of thing. And they had a gut feeling about the pasture, and that's why we went out and wanted to see what the condition was and how things were actually working. And like I said, they wanted to look at what water was existing, what fencing was existing, and what they needed to do. And again, how do they get their people involved in that? Next slide there, please. So when we actually finished the assessments, key takeaways from that, it's the document on the assessment is like about 100 pages long. But the tame pasture itself, probably healthy with problems. No litter, no plant litter. The guy had been grazing it, and probably he pretty well took every blade of grass he could get. And so there was some overutilization issues, and there was starting to come. So yeah, we realized right away some issues on balancing that forage supply and demand. The pasture is made up of tame, like the open areas is all for the most part tame pasture. Mixture of brome and Kentucky bluegrass for the most part. The forested areas, there's forested areas and there's wetlands in there too. And the forest areas are actually not bad shape. There's both coniferous forest and aspen forest there. And for the most part, the cows didn't go in there very much or didn't have too much of impact if they were in there. And there was good structure and there was good diversity of vegetation in there, and a lot of native type species still in those forest and wetland type situation. So it was good. That provided us the basis for, the stocking rate recommendations. And what we came up with on that 4,000 acres, we figured that it could hold about 270 pairs for 5 months. And that was the recommendation we came. He had been, considerably higher than that. The guy that was renting was considerably higher than that. Mrs. Losses had a talk with him, and I think they brought it back into what they felt was comfortable. And the other thing is that because there was no litter being built up at all, we needed to start to incorporate rest into the plan, so we did that. And the other thing, water. There's lots of potholes up in there, but they're really ephemeral, and there's not lots of them. The water becomes a limiting factor, and what was happening was that they dump them in. The cows would get dumped into one spot where there was water. They'd move them. They'd run out of water. They'd come back to where there was water, and the areas would be getting overgrazed. It just wasn't good distribution, and water was the main factor. So, next slide, please, sir. So the plan that we came up was this, and this is a map of the area. We divided it up into basically two pastures. If you look south, that's the blue lines, the dotted lines. Blue lines were the existing fence, and the dotted lines are the proposed fences that we put in. The other pasture is the north pasture, and the sort of a purple, again, dotted lines are proposed fences, and purple lines are. So that creates a number of fields. They will have to probably go around and do up the fences. There's probably fence. They've been working on some of the fences already. The biggest thing is we need to address the water. And there's a red spot on that on the map there. That's actually a water treatment center where there's a source of water. And we're proposing that will be the source of water, and we will run pipelines north to the blue triangles. So there's about four new water sites that should supply adequate water supply to all the pastures in the north. And then there's 5 green triangles in the south, and running a pipeline to those water sites. And so again, we're going to be able to address the water situation through a shallow buried pipeline. Working with a guy named Barry Irving from Alberta. He's retired. He used to work at Kinsella Ranch, and he's now doing some private pipeline business. And he's been out and he surveyed the area, so he's got a pretty good handle on what the system could look like. So the other thing to be aware of too is in this you'll see some Ducks Unlimited land, and so Nissawasis has a relationship with Ducks Unlimited, and they're allowed to access 2, maybe 3/4, no, maybe 2/4, and we're including that in the rotation. So you're creating a good collaboration. In the south, you also have 3/4 of certificate of possession land, and if you don't know what that is, that's basically the closest thing a First Nation person can have to private ownership on the reserve. However, it's still federal land. It's just that they have control over those lands, and I think we've been able to work a deal. They've been able to work a deal with the people that have the certificate of possession and include them in the. I think there's 3/4. That will actually allow the grazing, because I think those 3/4 hadn't been grazed before in the past. So that allows us to build a rotation where they can go into first, and then we can get around. Yeah. And also shows us some significant collaboration between agencies. They are applying for the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association funding through their rotation. We haven't heard back whether or not, and we're probably going to be going to the Minister of Agriculture's Farm and Ranch Water Infrastructure Program, help them with water development. So that system itself will address things like range health, rest, utilization, distribution. But when you start talking about the lease management, one of the things that they wanted to do was uh, create a better relationship with their lessee. And so part of the plan includes a number of things that they want the lessee to report back on. And then that includes like simple things like number of animals, day take in, take out, dates of moves, when did they move from one field to the next, comments on like if he sees weed patches, if he sees areas of overutilizations or underutilization or range readiness, when are some fields ready to go? They want him to report back on this. And then also to identify, any training needs that him or the band could do. So there's a list of things that now Mr. Watson is asking the leasing to do. Again, taking more control of how they're managing. And as far as employment goes, when we're putting this pipeline, and they've got a vested interest because they're contributing the the horsepower, the tractors, that kind of stuff, manpower to help build the pipeline and to build the fence. So, I mean, they are getting some sort of employment. It hasn't gone as far as ownership of cattle yet, but you never know. Anyways, that's the Mr. Wass's experience in a nutshell. I want to give one other example of planning. So next slide, please. So this is an example from way down south by Val Marie, Saskatchewan. If you don't know where Val Marie is, it's like a stone's throw from the U.S. border, and it's a very, very drought prone area. This guy asked us if we'd be interested in coming to his place and doing investments, and I think his thoughts were that his distribution problem was a problem. That's where he was having his biggest problem. He felt like he had areas of underutilization, especially on this map. On the right hand side, there's about 8 quarters and one up there. Just felt like the cows never got up. We did the assessment. We found that those areas, it's high elevation, no water, so big problem there. So we knew that was going to be an issue. But I want to, next slide, please. So when you sit down and start planning with a guy, it can start as something as simple as taking a Jiffy marker and a map. And I'm serious. Just, to start with, it tells you where the guy's head is at, how he's managing right now, and what his goals are, and what kind of changes he thinks is. And you can see already, like these are some of the existing fences on his place, and the stuff on the left in those black squares, they were basically tame pasture, and he'd already split his tame from his native. He hadn't done that. The stuff in the center there was, south center was a modified. There's been a lot of invasion of crested wheatgrass in the areas. He was almost treating that as a tame, and he was trying to graze that southwest stuff for in the first, and then the first. There's a fairly big block of native there, and he had basically 3 big fields there. But again, the point is, this is something as simple as how you can start. And next slide, please. So at the end of the day, water was really almost unattainable on that side there. We scoured the records from the Water Security Agency on wells. There was no power in it there. There was no real groundwater in the area. The soils and the topography wasn't conducive to putting in dugouts. And in order to do that, it was almost cost prohibitive. Think about how we were going to get water over there. So for the time being, all we did was come up with a simple solution to divide that center block into, take it 6 quarters and divide it in half, and allow a little bit more distribution. So again, deferred on it, and that a very, very small type project. I think the project was 7,000 to do, and it didn't really address the issue just because of the cost. Um, but what came out of it too was that I said, like we've got other programs. What do you think? And he ended up actually putting an easement on his native at the end of the day of this, and that's not what we started out to do. We talked about grazing management a long time, and he just said, "Well, I think we want to protect this and make sure that it never gets developed." And so we actually signed an easement. Anyway, it's just another approach to do that. So I'm getting very close to the end, but next slide, please. Um, I want to comment. You hear about grazing systems, and there's lots and lots of different grazing systems people talk about. They all have their good points. They all have their bad points. I want to talk about three of them, three or four of them. And I'm going to start with the one that everybody throws under the bus, the continuous grazing system. That's basically, when you put your cows out there, they manage a long field for the whole season. And it's not as common as you think. Like there's people, like I worked on some research projects where the researchers wanted to compare continuous versus some sort of rotation. And I remember back in the mid-90s, we were looking for places like this, and guys said, we talked to different ranchers. Yeah, I continuous graze. I graze them here for about a month continually, and then I moved to the next field and I continuously graze them there for okay. So what guys call continuous grazing, maybe. And there wasn't a lot of people do that, and especially in the Southwest, most of these guys actually are deferred. They're continuing on. They're not putting them out. But there are ways to manage this. You manage them with very low or very conservative stocking rates. That means that you're actually putting in, low inputs. And what's going to happen is you will have areas of where cows don't get to, and there will be areas of uneven utilization. And what you get with that is a couple things. One, productivity is relatively low, but inputs are low too. The other thing is you get a mosaic of habitats. You get a diversity, the biodiversity on some of these big, large native pastures that are continuously grazed. Is you'll have areas that are built up, and you'll have areas where you'll have lots of pack dynamics where cows have grazed and stuff. And if you think about it, what does wildlife need? They need that mosaic, and that's good. And the guy's probably not getting his maximum production off there, but there's ways to do that. And like I mentioned on the Cypress Hill study, water management is a big deal. You can control distribution by water management, and like I said before, hazing and settling. Those are things you can do on this kind of stuff. But it's not as bad. And I've seen pastures that continuous graze that, in my opinion, are in really good shape. And I've seen pastures that are continuously grazed because you probably put too many cows on there that are completely not in good shape. I don't say they're news, but in some cases they are. And so, there's ways to get around it. And like I said, on the continuous stuff, biggest point is balancing that forage supply and demand. So next system, the rest rotation stuff is basically a rotation system where one field in the rotation gets a complete year off. And this works really well on native and drought prone areas. And if you think back to what I said about, the rest requirements of native, they need, 400 days. That means you've got to build a rotation there where they get a year off every now and then. And then you adjust the rotation to ensure that each field gets a long rest period, at least 1 year, so that if you pull the cows off of one field, say June 1st, you're not putting them on till June 1st of next year. And you can do that. You can build that rotation like that. And that means that you're paying attention a little bit more to the rotation. Grazing periods are generally a little bit longer than yap grazing. They're like 30 days. It's pretty. The guys will run cows on the field for 30 days, and they do it with a lower stock density, so they don't put that high intensity type stuff on there. And I really like that. I actually I go rest rotation is one of my favorite ways to impose grazing management. And on our place here, we try to rest anywhere from 300 to 600 acres every year, so that I've always got. You hit a drought, I've always got a place to put those cows in the spring. First thing in the spring, that's where they go, and I've got there, and that allows the rest of my fields to start to grow and become ready to graze at some point later on in time. It's just, personally, a way I really like, next slide, please. So what you're going to hear, you hear a lot now on this app grazing. And what that is, it's adaptive, multi-pasture type grazing. It's, what? It's been around forever. It used to be called high intensity short duration grazing. That back in the late 80s, early 90s, you'd see these pie diet or these quarter sections divided up into pies with a central watering point, and guys would, rapidly move their cows around, graze everything. A lot of gee whiz speeches about them. And now you're seeing it as AMP. It's being promoted. Right now the off-cap program is promoting it through the Canadian Forage and Grassland, where like it's a high intensity, short duration grazing. And it doesn't, I don't think it works particularly well in the dry areas of the province and on native stuff. But I'll give you an example in a sec. But it has been around a long time. And I remember when I did my master's, like one of the first books I read was a book by Andre Boyson. He was a French dairyman in the 1950s, I think. And because they had lots of moisture and good growing conditions all the time, he was running his dairy cows through a 12 or 15 paddock rotation where he's moving every day, and that's the kind of stuff they're promoting now. And off-cap's promoting now because there's some modeling that suggests that carbon can be sequestered on these type of grasses, type of pastures using this grazing system. And personally, I think it works better on your tame and higher moisture areas. Like you've got a longer growing season and you've got better moisture conditions. It just works that much better. Basically, what it is that you got a short grazing period. When I did my master's, I said like it took after you grazed the plants, it took 5 days before those plants started to regrow again as regrowth. And so the grazing period is 5 days, and followed by appropriate rest. I mean, what that does is it avoids grazing regrowth. And what's the classic definition of grazing overgrazing? That is grazing regrowth before it's fully recovered. And so that's what it's doing. It's trying to avoid that. But you have to follow it up with rest, and you have to balance the intensity of grazing with it. And if you don't do that, if you continually intensively graze it and even rest it, you never build up any plant litter. And plant litter is an important component of range health in terms of soil moisture conservation, in terms of nutrient recycling, and that. And so, if you only take half, then you can actually build up there. And I've seen that. So I think it takes a lot of management to do this high intensity short duration or app grazing. And I see guys using it as part of their overall plan. Areas like they may take a half section or a quarter section and do it on their tame pasture within their bigger ranch. I know one family out by Morse. Same thing. I think they took a quarter section or half section and they do that on that and then that's where they keep the cows for, May and June maybe, and then they move them out onto more extensive type grazing on the native ranges. I see guys use this as part of a rotation with polycrop. I've seen it, that kind of stuff. And I've seen good and I've seen bad. I've seen areas where the guy pays attention to, not grazing it too intensely, ensuring there's some litter, ensuring that there's proper rest, and it actually looks pretty good. I've seen bad. Back in the late 80s, there was some snake oil salesmen out there that were, promising 3 times the stocking rates increases, and guys would buy into that. And I remember looking, this was the drought too, but I remember looking at one guy's pasture middle of July, and there wasn't a blade of grass left on his complete patch at all. And it was just, but he bought into it and built the fences and that kind of stuff. It wasn't a good scenario, but it's been working. Now, having said too that I don't like it on native, or I don't think it works on native, I know a couple guys that are actually doing it, and they're doing a really, really good job. There's a guy down by council. He's been doing it. He does it with yearlings, but the way he does it is he runs these 5-day grazing periods, runs through all his fields with yearlings. As soon as they finish their once over rotation, and he moves them when there's about 50% utilization. And when he's done there, whatever time it is, like he basically takes his 50%, runs through the rotation, and then he'll sell those yearlings. So that's his kind of a cash flow thing. When you go out and look at it, it looks in really, really good shape. Like good, it would rate really, really well. And I know he may have got some funding through not OFCAF, maybe it was part of another research study on carbon, but the carbon results were inconclusive. I know that. So he is kind of disappointed about that. Anyways, so I've seen that. I've seen other places too that they're doing it. They're paying attention to the principles of that, and they're moving them more often. I think so the intensity really needs to be gauged, or how intense you graze that. So again, it's all about adaptation. So next slide there, please. So this is the last piece I want to talk to. It's not really a grazing system, but it kind of is. What if you set your goals, or you provided the goals to achieve certain things, and you let the producer figure out how to get that? We've tried that with a couple things, and we're running through a pilot right now using the bird friendly index. That's basically, we send out bird crews to a pasture, and if he scores 0.5 or better, which is meaning you're better than average for that eco site, eco region, you get a financial payment, and you just basically leave him to decide how he does it. And it's just a way of managing. It's kind of like a results based or an outcome based, and we're running that right now, and we're looking for more producers to see if they want to get involved in this kind of. We've done this in the past. Next slide there, please, Manny. We've done this in the past with. Remember, I talked about greater sage-grouse. We know what the habitat requirements of sage-grouse was, and especially on critical habitat for greater sage-grouse. You want really robust type silver sage plants, because they need to that they need to hide, so that they need litter. They need the grass height, and for their chicks, they need forbs. So that means like forbs tend to get eliminated under unutilized areas. So you have to have some grazing there, but you also have enough to allow the life cycle of the greater sage. So we identified a whole bunch of these targets for the producer to meet, and he figures out how to retain them. And we ran, I think we had like a dozen, agreements with them back in and this was the Stock Growers Association, the SODCAP. We had those in place there, and we paid an annual payment to them for achieving these goals. It involves So two things. Both these things involve um, annual payments, and they involve monitoring. So there's got to be some verification of habitat. But I think they're really, really good ways to encourage management, especially if you're, like as a funding agency, your interest lies in birds or lies in sage grouse or involves carbon or whatever. So I just wanted to bring that out, and it's just gets back to your goals. What are your goals to manage this land, and then design your system to do that. So that's where I'm going to end this. Next slide there, please. So obviously I have to acknowledge people that are funding. We have three main funders. Western Family Foundation is the biggest supporter of us right now. Environment Canada has given us some money for restoration projects, and National Fish and Wildlife to allow easements. Also, they're supporting birds. And then I listed off a number of people we work with, and I'm probably missing a bunch of people too. Anyways, I'm going to wrap that up now. If there's any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Awesome. That was great. Thank you so much, Tom. We are just a little past 2:30, so of course, if anyone needs to go, that's no problem. But we will have a little bit of time set aside still for some question and answers. We do have one more quick survey that we're just going to try and pull up here. I'll also put the link in the chat that you can access. And then otherwise, there's the QR code there. This survey really helps just to inform future events for us and experiences, so we do appreciate your participation in it. I'll give about a minute or so. We'll try and keep it quick for people to answer, and then we'll get into our questions. One more thing I want to mention too, we will send out one more email after the webinar with additional grazing management resources through the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation. If you're interested in either beginning your journey or looking to enhance your current grazing plan, so you can look out for that email. And again, if you don't see it right away, it might be in your spam or junk mail, so check there as well. All right, just do a few more seconds here. And we have a few questions right off the bat. So I'll try and keep it quick for you, for everybody. So Tom, I'll start with our first question here. And you might have answered some of this. These did come in throughout the presentation, so you might have answered some of these a bit, but you might have a little more you could add as well. So what's the biggest barrier or challenge that you see producers face when transitioning to rotational grazing, and how can they overcome it? Are there any small changes that you would recommend for someone just starting to improve their grazing system?
Yeah, well, biggest barrier is time and money, right? You've seen that before. It's kind of a mindset. Like I said, you really have to evaluate what you're hoping to achieve with your grazing management. If you want to get into rotational grazing and do that, really evaluate how much time you can spend on this, especially if it's a higher intensity type system that you're getting into. Is just take a look at what you're trying to achieve and take a look at what you have. When it comes to time, big thing, time. The more inputs you put into this, more time, it takes more time out of your day to do that. And if you got that, and the other thing is, cost of fencing too is starting to skyrocket. I mean, like, it wasn't a few years ago. I mean, we could build a fence for $3,000 or $4,000 a mile. Now we're probably looking at least $10,000 a mile to build a fence. Like, this is a permanent fence, of course. So maybe one of the things you start looking at is test drive it a bit. Maybe using some of these range wards or razor grazers, and like mobile units. See if you can grab one of those things and
and you know, try it that way. You know, just some examples there.
Nice. Yeah, it's a good idea. All right. What strategies can be incorporated for building drought resilience in grazing systems? How should producers adjust their grazing plans during drought or unusually wet years without degrading the land?
Well, exactly. I think I mentioned this. I mean, year in, year out, you set your stocking rates to, you know, below what you think you're going to get. I mean, you know that you will get years of overuse or overproduction, and you'll get years of underproduction. So you want to set those stocking rates just at below the average. Uh, and then in the you know, in the wet years, you just either let it grow and you build up litter, and that helps. That's like money in the bank, the litter is. The other thing is, you know, like if you really feel like you need to utilize some of that extra growth, you bring in yearlings or animals that are quick disposable. You know, lots of guys have spent lots of money on their cow herds and their genetics, and that's important to them. And you know, maintaining that genetic base to their cow herd, they don't want to let that go. They don't want to sell that off in dry years. But yearlings, you can dispose of them, you know, relatively quickly, and that's what I've seen. A friend of mine, Brian Whedon, he's retired now, but he used to ranch over by Hazlett. He always did that. He always kept a couple hundred yearlings around, and when times are good, you could use them. When times are not so good, they went to Heartland and they were gone. So, yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's good idea. All right. I'm just checking if we have any other questions in the chat here. Okay, we have one more. Can you shed any light on shrub encroachment management, more specifically wolf willow, on underutilized native rangeland areas?
Yeah. Okay. I grew up in southwest Saskatchewan, where it's typically hot and dry all the time. And when I saw a little patch of wolf willow, I actually liked it because the calves could lay in that stuff and get out of the hot dry. Where, you know, I viewed it as an asset. But we are, you know, our organization now is starting to expand our geographical scope out of the southwest, and we're moving into the rest there. And what we're running into right now is we've got a few guys that are you know, they see brush encroachment as an issue and taking away grazing value and that kind of thing. The other thing, you know, the brush does too is it affects our grassland bird populations. Like there's certain species that are just avoid areas with brush. So we're actually implementing this year. We're looking at I think we've got 4 potential projects on woody plant encroachment, and that includes looking at things like mulching and spraying, and we even got one guy considering fire, which I find amazing. But one, you're going to get rid of the structure, and then you have to follow it up with a graze to basically get the regrowth under control. Basically, you're overgrazing the snowberry or the wolf willow, and especially if it's in hindrance. So there's ways to get rid of it and ways to control it. The thing is to actually look at the situation, and is it really a problem? You know, look at it. Is it preventing cattle from getting in and grazing, or is it taking away from the forage base? And then be aware too, like snowberries I'd be more concerned about snowberry than I am about wolf willow. Wolf willow sometimes is there because of high moisture or high water tables, and it's a probably part of the natural community. It also is a nitrogen fixer, and it does add to the soil component. So there are benefits to all these things at the same time. So just do a heavy think on, you know, what you're trying to accomplish here.
Awesome. All right. I think that's it for questions for now. I'm not seeing any others. We'll just do one more check. Okay, no, I think we're good. And we do have on the screen here, if you do have any follow-up questions afterwards, you are free to email the bridge at that email on the screen there, and we can help you connect with Tom and he can answer any of your questions. Otherwise, we will follow up with our email about those resources, and if you were late or you had to leave early, it will be online, this presentation, next week on our YouTube channel. Other than that, I think we're done. Thanks so much, Tom. Again, really appreciate you taking the time out, and to everyone who attended today, and have a great day. Good luck with the blizzard if you are dealing with that.
Yeah, I'm
All
heading,
right.
I'm heading out into the pit now, so.
Yeah, all right. Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Okay, thanks.